betrayal. Next up we have Daniel Mark Schwartz. He always brings an interesting new perspective to all of the projects that we bring here. He actually is a specialist in off-grid permaculture. Really exciting for us to have him on board here. And in my own personal opinion, he's just an absolute genius. So stand by for like a really great show. Here he is.
Good.
Dan.
You got a lot to look up to now.
I know, now I got to work really extra hard. So, I'm Daniel, as Dave was so kind to introduce, and I'm the primary author and founder of offgridpermaculture.com. And I'm going to get into that, what that means, but before we start, I'd just like to say all of my talks I do a little bit different. I consider it more of a discussion, so I'm going to just keep going, but if anything comes up where you want to have a question or interjection or you want to correct me or anything like that, raise your hand or feel free to blurt it out and we can go from there. So this is free to be as much of a two-way street as you guys want to make it. So I consider myself to be an off-gridder and a permaculturist. And what permaculture is, if you're not familiar, it's the idea of looking into nature and using the systems that nature provides us as a model to build human systems. And the word permaculture comes from permanent agriculture, but it also comes from the term permanent human culture. Right? So permaculture isn't just necessarily about planting fields a certain way or having certain types of livestock or water systems, even though that's a lot of what I do personally on my website, but it is really about developing sustainable human ecosystems. When that includes a huge part is the family. So what I'd like to talk today a little bit about is how can we as an individual in the family serve to guide it and build it in a way that is constructive. So it's not just overcoming necessarily the issues that we've had in the past, but working through those issues to build the family that we want for the future. So I hope this is, has a few different points in here than you might normally see in a discussion like this. So the first thing I always need to start out with is that yes, it is okay for you to want to have a better family. And whenever I discuss this with people or I'm involved with counseling sessions, it often comes up that many people who are in abusive situations or have traumatic family experiences, deep down, don't necessarily believe that it's okay for them to be part of a better experience. And the reasons for that are manifold, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but just to start the whole discussion, it's not presumptive for you to say, I'm going to take the lead with my family and move them in the right direction, as much as they're willing. We're not forcing, we're building a system where they would love to join us in it, but it is completely right for us to take where we are and try to move it just one step in the better direction, if not many steps. So the number one barrier that people have when they're building a better family, and in fact building a better ecosystem, whether it's with water, whether it's sustainable agriculture, it's the limiting thoughts that we come in with. And these limiting thoughts come from manifold places, from our teachers, from our parents, from our siblings, society around us, and sometimes they come from childhood experiences that we misinterpret incorrectly. But nevertheless, they're there, often subconsciously, and many times even contrary to what we believe that we think. But they are underlying all of the logical, they predispose all of our logical thoughts, what we think are logical thoughts, in a certain direction. And so without addressing these and bringing them to light and trying to use them to move us in the next direction, then we're pretty stuck. So these are some common limiting thoughts that I see. I'm not good enough. In my family, they're never going to change. They're always going to be this way. Too much has happened in the past between us to ever go back, right? It's permanently ruined. Bringing up blank, whatever happened, it's just too painful for me, and it's just too painful for everybody else, and it's better off if nobody ever mentions it ever again. Lastly, why would I even try? I'm just going to fail. Right? My family is not going to respond to it. I'm not going to be strong enough, right? So everybody has thoughts like this at some time in their life. And when they come up, it's important to look at them and realize, this is the thought process that has kept me in this situation the whole time. And if I don't address them head on, or at least accept them, if there's a thought that you feel like, I can't get over this now, at least accept it and say, well, this is my situation now, and maybe it'll be better in the future, but you know, I just can't go into this now, but I'm knowingly doing it and I'm intentionally doing it. So that's a huge step in the right direction. Now I love this section. The first step before we even get started addressing the other people in our family is to address ourselves. And the number one mindset that we can take is, you know, you are part of it and you are partially responsible. Now there's a huge difference between responsibility and being at fault, right? It's your fault if you caused it, you know, and we're not really here to send fault, but on the other hand, there's responsibility. And there's the analogy of if you find a baby on the street and you have no idea why it got there, but you're there now, you're responsible for that baby until it can be taken care of, right? It's not your fault that the baby's there, but at the time being, because of who you are, where you are in the world, that's your responsibility. So for us and family, we're going to take a look at what's around us, you know. For all the bad things that's happened to us, we've also played a part in that. And it's not our fault that those have happened, but it is in part our responsibility to try to get past those situations, or at least limit them as much as possible from happening in the future. So the first step is to acknowledge your role in the situation. And this is a very empowering thing to do, but what have you tacitly approved by not objecting, right? So we have a responsibility in our lives and our families, not only to go with the flow, but to, when we see something that does not align with our personality, with our values, to object in some way. It doesn't have to be forceful, but you at the very least need to not add your energy to that situation. And many times when we're in a bad family situation, we are shutting our mouth, you know, keeping quiet, or even, you know, somewhat approving other people's behavior, and that is part of the problem, right? So by taking that role, you can say, okay, this is a little bit of this problem that I do have control over. Also, what do you do that leads to behavior in your family members that you dislike? You know, it's so often that I see people who complain about family members and, you know, he does this and she does that, and then as soon as the situation starts to build up again, they play into it. Like, because in some ways, it's nice to not be the worst one. So if everyone else can be worse than you, then, or at least, you know, there's one person next to you, then, you know, in some ways that can sometimes feel a little good. You know, at least it doesn't feel bad. And so a lot of times when you have a difficult family situation, you maybe are 50% or 20% or even 5%, a little bit pushing it forward. And the last thing, are you enabling this behavior? People that have very serious traumatic experiences, hopefully we don't lose power here, but people have very serious family, traumatic experiences in their family. There's often somebody who's enabling it. You know, it may be you, it may not be you, but it's important that we take a deep look at ourselves and say, you know, am I causing this? Am I helping this, or am I not? And I love when we talk about enablers, there's, you know, I got one of my little guilty pleasures is I kind of like to watch these reality shows where it's got extremely overweight people, because it's fun to watch the family dynamics. And yeah, that's a great one. Heavy's another great one. And I like it because, you know, it's a very clear problem that these people are having, you know, and it's very unfortunate for them because they're often, you know, it's a life and death situation to be that big. But almost every time, there's somebody there that loves them who is letting this happen to them. And in fact, helping them, bringing them food. And it's not, you know, it's not a combination of that person. They probably really believe that they're helping this person, but unfortunately they're not. And so by watching these extreme situations, it can kind of give you a little insight into your own life and go, you know, maybe I'm not as bad as that, but, you know, am I doing that a little bit? Maybe. And just to end this little, you know, caveat, reiterating again that this isn't about being at fault with anything. This is about the power that you get from taking responsibility of what you do have control over. And many times when people are in a victim situation or they're surrounded by toxic people, they are taught through their interaction with this person to play a victim role. And by saying, okay, I'm not the victim necessarily, you know, this is my role in this situation, you've taken back your power and you can grow from there. All right, so the next step is all imagination, and it's about dreaming big. And I link this into the permaculture mindset, because with permaculture, you don't just go to a site and start building and planning, you know, the way that we do in the Western world, because you miss so much and you cause so many problems. You know, if you look at how houses are built now, we waste so much energy just because they didn't take the time to put the house facing the proper direction, or we think roads get washed out because they didn't stop to say, well, how's the water going to flow? And it's way better if we can work with the natural environment and with our families than work against it. And so you're never going to do that unless you take the time to be quiet and to watch and just to take stock of what the situation is without trying to change it, and then work from there. And so along with this whole stage is not an action stage, it's an imagination stage and a data taking stage. So first thing, what do you really want? If you get into changing your family, building an intentional family or intentional community, it's very important to know where you're going, because if you're not going anywhere, you're definitely going to get there. So there's a lot to this really, but the core of it is what methods can we use to get to the heart of what we really want and to figure that out, because that's one of the hardest things in life, is to figure out what do we really want. So I put some 3 very basic ways of doing that I like to use with clients and that I use for myself. One of which is journaling and reviewing the journal. And this is very simple. It could just be writing down, however you're comfortable, daily or weekly, about things that happened, and just take stock, and then go over everything that you've written, with fresh perspective, weeks later, stuff you might have forgotten, and just see, how do you feel about it? That gets you a long way in the right direction. The only caveat I have about that is try to be as compassionate as possible. So try to leave all judgment of yourself and other people out of it as much as possible. You can acknowledge the way that you felt at the time, which is totally fine, but this shouldn't be, a bitch sheet, to pardon my language, but it should be just, as objective of a record as you possibly can, and that's the most effective way. Another way is role playing. You can do this by yourself or with other people, but switch roles. So, you were in the situation and other family members were in the situation, and it's really helpful to get into their head and see from their perspective by actually taking their side in the argument, right? And try to be as both understanding of their situation and figure out how you think they should have handled it, right? So some of this is mapping out, like, how would I have wanted them to deal with this? Because they're obviously annoyed by something I've done, right? How would I have wanted them to come and correct me with that? What's a better way? So a lot of this method is figuring out, how would I prefer that situation had gone. The other thing is devil's advocate, and I love this one. It really gets people in other people's head, because the basis of this method is when there's a conflict in your family, whether you're part of it or not, take the opposite side of the one that you are initially agree with, and then do everything you possibly can to argue for that side. Make the other side completely wrong, go completely ham. This could be a journaling exercise, it could just be in your head, this could be role-playing this again, but by doing that, trying to see the worst possible, the most extreme other point, it can sometimes give you insight into what other people are thinking around you. And often, a lot of family situations, in part, come down to a bit of misunderstanding or to poor communication. Poor communication is a huge part of it. So the first step to proper communication, or at least figuring out what you're up against, is getting in the head of everyone else in the situation. So the goal of all of this, figuring out what you want, is write down detailed behavior of what you will accept from your families and what you won't, right? This is kind of a dividing line, so I won't accept them demeaning me necessarily, but if I have to put myself second for certain activities, that's fine. But my children, they won't be able to say this to my children, but I will let them do grandma time, whatever it is, in your particular situation. It's very good to have a clear set of boundaries, which you will and will not accept, which comes up later in the steps. And the last little tidbit is, don't limit at this stage, when you're kind of dreaming of what you want, don't limit your imagination at all by what you think is realistic, right? That will come later. For now, let you be as free as possible. Imagine the most extreme, grandiose, perfect family. When you're role-playing or devil advocate, go extreme as you possibly can, because this is a mental exercise, and it's about building up your perception and about building up your understanding. So we'll get to making it more of a realistic goal later, but for now, go ham. Now, a few things that come up when people are doing this, and one is projections. So projection is a psychological concept that what you perceive in yourself, you see in other people in exaggerated form. And so this comes up too. One is others are going to project on you. And a lot of family issues frequently, especially from parents to children, come from projections, where the parents are seeing their faults or issues that they've had in their past in their children, and so their behavior to you seems crazy because they're not seeing you as you really are. They're seeing you as they perceive you with, you know, the certain grotesque parts magnified based on what their issues are. So their desires that, you know, have gone unfulfilled, their failures and their shortcomings are usually where those projections come from, their perceived shortcomings. Then there's also projections, you know, everyone has them and we project on other people. And it's very important to be wary when we're doing our introspection of which projections that we're employing, you know, how that's affecting our perception of the situation, and to try to counteract that as much as possible. So where this will come up when it's in you is you will exhibit extreme sensitivity to situations that may not have seemed unusual to anybody else involved, right? People may be a little confused about what you're doing because you're seeing, you know, you're maybe seeing criticism in somebody else's behavior to you, but they're not even cognizant that they're talking to you at all. They're just doing their thing, and because of our past, we're seeing that issue. You're also going to read emotion and meaning in other people's behavior that isn't necessarily there, which is a very similar, though slightly different way of looking at it. And then you're going to see, likewise, their shortcomings based on what you perceive your own shortcomings are. So it's not that what your real shortcomings are necessarily, but what you perceive it, you will see in your parents and your children, you know, everyone around you. So how do we really get deep into this? And so there's a whole bunch into there, but basically building up introspection is a lifetime skill, and it's not just about developing good families, but if you want to be an effective person, the more you can introspect, the better. And so here's some 3 very basic ones. There's many more. You know, I'm going to do another one in a couple weeks actually, so if you are interested, check that out. Beginning techniques, journaling, of course, we talked about a little bit, but journaling is super easy. Anybody can do it if you can write, which is pretty much everybody, and everybody here. And it's a good way to get started. Insight meditation, there's tons of meditation methods out there and guided ones. And the one that I like to teach people to get started is a type of insight meditation. And there's a lot to it. You know, I studied this a bit in Thailand, but the very basic thing is to just sit comfortably and try to get all the thoughts out of your head and just focus on your breath. And you know, there's different ways you can focus. I always like to start people on the navel and just perceive it rising and falling. Now, that's kind of the target, right? But you're never going to achieve that right away. You may, you know, after practice, you may get to where that is all you're looking at. But what's going to come up is a bunch of thoughts. You're going to have thoughts come up. At first, it's going to be like, "Oh, I'm doing great. This is perfect." And like, "Oh crap, I thought of something," you know. But as you try this, you know, 5 or 10 minutes a day, you know, once a week, that's all you really need. And as you do this more and more, deeper and deeper thoughts will come up, and you'll just be sitting there thinking about your breath, and then you'll have a thought like, "Man, why did my mom say that to me?" You know, or "Why did my kid do that?" And you'll even feel like strong emotions occasionally, and that's you know, that stuff is stuff that's been in there, but you haven't even necessarily thought of for years, and you're like, "Where did that come from?" And that's a great basis to get started with this. Last is NLP, and there's a lot of methods of this too, neuro-linguistic programming. And one of the most basic ones is to go, when you have a very pronounced situation in your past, you know, something that still affects you and you still remember it, you can go back into that situation, imagine it happening again, and then make it wacky, right? So speed up what was happening, slow it down ridiculously, make everyone sound like they're having helium, make colors crazy, right? And this is a neural technique to where you do this 3, 4, 5 times, and you'll think back and you have lost all the emotional impact of that event. And it's profoundly effective. And if there's anything that you've been suffering of, you know, very specific events that, you know, are seared in your mind, it's a great place to get started. And of course, there's tons more information online about that too. So it's a great place to get started. And just to finish up this little segment, you know thyself. For thousands of years, it's the most important thing, the most important goal of life is to really know who you are deep down. And there's so many layers to the individual that is you, that you could spend a lifetime, and you probably should spend a lifetime, getting deep down to it. So everything that we do in this realm is highly productive. So now we're getting into action. Right? First thing to do is to set appropriate boundaries. Right? This is probably the easiest thing, and it's something that is you have the right to set your own boundaries with your family members. They may fight you on it, and you know, if you have a traumatic family, they probably will. But you are 100% in your rights to set your boundaries. And so how are we going to do that? Well, one, be very clear, and we talked about this previously, but be very, very clear about what you're willing to accept and what you're not. Because how many times they're going to approach it if you have toxic family members, is they're going to try to nudge you off it, right? If you set your line, they're going to just put their toe over a little bit. And then a couple weeks later, they're going to move a little farther over. And they're going to slowly push you back against the wall, bit by bit. That's why you have to set very clear boundaries. The other reason to set clear boundaries, of course, is because you know, everyone is like a dog or like a child in a certain respect. We are all trainable. And if you hit the same point over and over and over again, eventually they're going to learn, right? Whether they like it or not. But if we change our point, if we take these step backs and are allowed to be wavy, they're not. It's going to take a lot longer to actually really get the point across subconsciously to them. Right? This isn't necessarily about conscious them accepting, but it's the whole thing with elephants, right? You put a baby elephant tethered. It learns that it can't go anywhere, and by the time it's adult, even though it could rip out the tether and walk away, it will never do it because it's learned that it can't subconsciously and won't even try. So by putting your own tether there, they may pull at it, and eventually they're just going to not even think about doing it. Now, the point of this is not necessarily to be an authoritarian. We're not putting our foot down with our family. So by setting these boundaries, take the time to look for compromise and for win-win situations. You may not get that every time, but this isn't about us, you versus them. It's about how can we together make a situation that works the best for everybody. So along that vein, avoid being adversarial or judgmental with your boundaries, right? The boundaries are about what you like, about what is good for you and what's good for the family. It's not about punishing somebody else for what they've been doing to you. And in order to make this work, you need to write it down and you need to review where the boundaries have been set and which ones have been working, which ones don't. If you don't follow up and keep on it every day, every week, or every time you have an interaction, it's going to be very difficult to make good headway. So, step 2, ask for what you want. It's amazingly frequent how people, they talk about a family and they complain about the situation, and then I'll ask them, well, did you tell that person about it? Did you say, hey, could you act, would it be possible for you to be a little more accepting in these situations or whatever it is? And oftentimes, no. The people involved in this that are their adversaries in the situation don't even maybe know that they have a problem at all. So it's a huge mistake not to verbalize your needs. And now, if you tell people, there's no guarantee that they're going to comply or even care. But at least if you haven't started in that direction, there's very little chance of it going any farther. So methods of doing this. Ask as a favor. You're not accusing them. You're not demanding anything. You're saying, hey, I would really appreciate it if you could do this. And we'll get into a little more examples of really how to do that later, but just as a basis. So phrase things as from your own perspective. So how our language is in modern times, we tend to be very factual. And so when somebody does something, you say, that was wrong to do, or why are you so like this, right? We don't want to do that. What we want to say is, when I was here, what I perceived was, it was like this. It just came across to me like that, and could we possibly change that? And reference specific actions. So a lot of times we approach people very abstract. Like, I don't like when you're rude to me. But what you can instead say is, I don't like what you said this time. I don't like that phrasing. It made me feel, not loved. And is there, can we work to change that? And then suggest specific actions that they can take to work in the right direction. Next time that this comes up, would you be able, to support me? Say something like this. It helps these people get in the right direction because sometimes they're so ingrained in the way that they, the verbal patterns that they have and the way that they think, that they may not even know really how to say something that's not abusive or not the way that they normally act. Right? So and in the end, it's a give and take. So if you can say, if you do this, I would be able to do this for you type of situation, by making me feel more comfortable, I'd be able to not be as combative or whatever that situation is. It lets you all come together, theoretically, on ideal situations as, let's work together to improve the situation. next action move, sometimes you're going to verbalize and they're going to say, I don't care, you're too sensitive. Well, what you can do in those situations, and in every situation, is to lead by example. So you're going to take pains to exhibit the behavior that you're requesting back to other people, whether they have asked for it or not necessarily. But try to model these good conflict resolution, like we talked about verbalizing before, model that to other people. In your family, when situations come up, use it yourself. And so oftentimes this can be the most effective way to go, because even if they're constantly doing it or not, people, if you're setting a strong example, they can start subconsciously taking the way that they behave and treating you the same way. And lastly, when you're leading by example, when people do something that is a step in the right direction, they've taken your advice to heart or they've started following your lead, take time to go out of the way and give them something, a positive reward for it. Everybody has something that they want, and a lot of the first step is kind of figuring out what your family members want from you. And so when they do something that you don't like, just don't hammer them, just try to cut off the energy that as much as possible. But when they do something you like, give them a little bit of what they like back. So this nonviolent communication is another large body of literature, and there's a lot there, but it's just a little tidbit of what you can use to change your language when you're working with other people. And the problem with a lot of English, how it's commonly used, is there tends to be a subtle judgment in it, whether we intend it or not, the way that we speak with other people. You're right, you're wrong, that's bad. And that isn't the most effective way to get people on board with what you're doing. Unless, if you're an authority figure, maybe that's great, but with our family members, we unfortunately have very little control over what they actually do. So if we need to get them on board, we're not going to say things like, can you stop blank? Because there's judgment in there. Why do you always do this? How can you act like this type stuff? That doesn't work. What we can do, and here's a very simple template, is when you do blank, it makes me feel like this. So now you're showing them your side, and you're a little bit forcing them, but leading them to do the same kind of introspection that you've done on them before. Then it would make me feel better in this situation if you did whatever. So now we're asking them, and we're letting them see the alternative. Like you can be oppressive to me, or you can be accepting, and specific, very specific as much as you can. And then ask them to get on board. What do you think about that? Ask for their input. They may have something, a new way of seeing it that you haven't experienced yet to interject, or that may not work for them, but hopefully they'll come back to you and say, this works this way for me, and you guys can open a dialogue from there. Because it's going to be a constant back and forth to get these things to work. So now we're looking into designing specifically families. So we've done actions, we're moving things in the right direction. And this is a real tie-in to the whole permaculture idea of let a chicken be a chicken. So we're trying to think of how our families can work together and what we can do to make the situation better. And we've started the dialogue, but in the end, there's certain qualities about family members that are going to mesh and aren't going to mesh. And it's a mistake to try to modify your family into some ideal, right? Most people change very little in their entire lifetime, and especially if they're not 100% on board with changing. So we can't really say, my father is not very emotional, he's detached. You're probably not going to have a whole lot of luck getting him too far from that. You can model him in the right direction, and maybe he'll come, maybe he won't. But what we can do is take the qualities of the people that are around us already and try to integrate them as well as they possibly can with the environment. So we're seeking opportunities for the natural tendencies of our family members to shine in a positive way. And one real visceral example of this type of activity going on from the permaculture side is, do we have these factory chickens farms, or do we have these free-range chicken, permaculture style? What are the problems with the factory farms? Well, we've got huge amounts of inputs going into getting food to them, right? So we're wasting energy bringing them food. They're so condensed in these cages that their manure actually burns their skin. Like these people have all these protective gear on just to be in there. And there's so much wrong with it, so much extra energy that doesn't need to be put into keeping them there, right? The alternative is to mix the environments correctly to where chickens are with things that they naturally like. And so they're eating They like eating bugs, so they're eating natural bugs, right? Chickens scratch and they poop and they do all this stuff. So instead of putting them in a cage where they don't like to be, by leaving them outside in positions where they're scratching and they're pooping actually help the situation, then we are putting out way less energy, both as individuals in that system and like energy as far as oil and electricity and all that, to keep the situation intact. So with our families, can we do the same thing? Can we put, take our father or mother, children, and put them in an environment where they can be who they are naturally, but it comes out in a way that's positive for everybody rather than a huge chore and a big waste of energy. So the key to this is optimize what's already there. And here's a few just little questions you can work through to get yourself closer to this. What are the best qualities of your troublesome family members? Excuse me. If you don't know, everybody pretty much knows, their criticisms of their family members. If I say, what's the worst part about, what most irks you about your mother or your father, I think everybody would have something ready to go. And your children probably too. Brother, aunts, uncles, any of that, anybody you spend any time with. But very few times if you ask somebody, what's the best quality of your mother or father or children or siblings, a lot of times it takes them, they have to think a little while, right? And so to put it bluntly, that's part of the problem. That's part of what led to this family trauma in the first place. So we can do our part to take the time and say, my dad isn't necessarily great at all this stuff, but he's really good at, whenever I'm in trouble, he's there. Or, my mom, she's not always the most organized, but, she comes in when I feel bad and she's ready there. She's got them, she's emotionally there for me, or, whatever it is. In your specific case, by having these things really delineated, it's a basis to start working through this planning process, but it also brings you in a much more compassionate mindset. Working through this again, how have they helped you in the past? So seeing where they came through for you is a huge emotional tie in the right direction, building these productive communities. Last thing, what situations do your family members really shine? So this is kind of bringing everything together and saying, I'm not necessarily, if it's a stressful cooking situation, maybe Aunt Linda or whatever shouldn't be in there. But if it's, kind of a one-on-one, maybe a few people, that's a little better. So maybe if we can figure out situations where she's involved, where it's in those kind of situations, maybe that's a little better. Or, so-and-so doesn't really thrive with, camping, whatever it is, all the things that you do in your life, but, this person does. So how can we involve everybody in these situations? But, maybe these people aren't necessarily doing this activity. Maybe, I'm one-on-one with this person for a certain period of time. Just taking the time to think this through. It doesn't have to be super complex. It's just thinking about it often gets you pretty far in the right direction. Okay, so take steps to avoid disastrous situations. So we talked about putting people in good situations. The other side of this is if there's a really bad situation that happens, maybe it's uncle at the dinner table with politics, or drinking or drugs, do whatever you can to not be around or to stop the situations. So 3, again, quick questions that you can use to journal with. What situations are you likely to lead to a problem? Just identifying these is huge, and just having a short list, usually it doesn't need to be a lot, 5 or 6, or maybe even 1 or 2, but just knowing is a big step. What can you do to lead, or what do you do that leads to such situations arising? So it's not necessarily a fault, but what have you done that has led to that, even if it's not intentionally? And so what control do you have? What is in your control to control triggering these situations? And it may be nothing, but often we have a little bit in our power, whether it's to suggest alternatives or to just not let those situations arise. If something bad is going to happen, just don't go. So now we're looking at a planning for contingencies. So this is talking about how can we actually deal with these problems now that we figure out what they are. And also, from the perspective of we're going to a family event, or we're going to be with family or this particular person, and we don't know what's going to happen. So we're using emergency preparedness techniques and thinking, how do we plan for the worst? What's the worst that could possibly happen? And how have we reached those bad situations in the past? Right? Just thinking through what, it could be 5 or 6 different things, but what is really bad that can happen here? Don't think it's necessarily going to happen, but if we know what the worst is, we can definitely handle everything else. Then what signals these problems coming on? The sooner that we can realize that they're coming, the more change we have on it. So as there's a certain type of behavior or talk that comes up, or is it, drinking unfortunately is a huge one. Is a couple glasses of beer in, and then something's coming down the pipe. Be wary of that and have it lined out, because a lot of times, in retrospect, we can see it. But in the minute, when we're engaged with family members, we haven't thought it through necessarily, and we are blindsided by these behaviors that come up. So then think through, what if anything can you do to prevent these behaviors from coming up? So we're talking about not necessarily, just the actions from before, but can we even stop the behaviors that lead to the problems? And then let's say that doesn't work. What will we do? What is our plan if the worst possible thing comes up? And it's great to have a written plan, or at least think it through before, because in the situation, we're way too emotional to make good decisions about what's going on. And if we just react to the moment, that's when things get really bad. So if we know there's a trigger point, and as soon as this family member starts being belligerent, that's it. That's when we make the call, and you have a contingency plan. Okay, we're leaving the situation. De-escalation is always a great place to start. Or it could be, bring a certain other person in, or I'm going to start, it depends on the situation, but maybe you want to discuss with the person what their issue is, or try to bring them out to separately and try to diffuse it that way. But having something planned out is a huge step in the right direction. And then leading on with the taking space thing, we all need times to be away from these difficult situations. And it's way better to not let it get worse. Or I should say, we prefer it getting better, but at the very least, we need to make sure it doesn't get worse. So sometimes you just gotta let everything cool down. So when you're involved with these family situations, whether somebody you live with full time or you're just visiting, figure out a place that you can go where you can deal with this stuff by yourself, or with people that are supportive of you, away from the family conflict. Having something in advance, like I mentioned before, is a huge boon, because then you don't have to think about it in the situation when you're too emotional. You can just trigger the action and go there. So one perspective on this is important that we look at the time that we take away as an opportunity, right? We're not retreating from the family, and we don't want to perceive, them to perceive us as making a retreat, right? This is us investing in ourselves with time and opportunity to make the situation better. And when you've realized, this is as far as I can go today, and doing it in the right direction, and if cutting your losses, and taking what gains you've already made and not going any step backwards is not a retreat at all. It is a strategic retreat, a strategic withdrawal. It's, if you're a general in a battle, sometimes you got to take a few steps back to get in the right position. So that's all we're doing here. And with your family members, it's very good to have a thought-out reason why you're leaving, and not some kind of excuse. So, I want to spend some time with my friends today, and I love being with you guys, but I need to take off right now, something like that. So you're not saying, I can't handle you guys anymore, I got to leave. That's not the way to approach it. Where you're approaching it with, I've got something even greater that I'm doing right now, and I'll come back to you guys later. So lastly, if we don't review how we've done, and we don't make constant adjustments, it's very unlikely that we're going to get as far as we want to go, because it's just difficult, constantly changing, so we need to take the time to review. First thing to go into this, it does take time to change. These are lifetime habits that we're approaching with people, and a lot of us, if we grew up in the situation, we maybe don't even know any better, or just learning to know how to handle this better. So if it took years to get settled in, or decades, let it go gradually. It might take months or years sometimes to get things all the way sorted out. Just don't get too antsy if things don't seem to be improving right away. Keep up with it. Next thing, keep notes about, this could be in your journal or whatever, but I like notes to be very short, because if you have voluminous pages, that might be fine for the journal because you're working through things there. But if you have a separate note section that's short that you can really review quickly, especially like right before going to a family situation, that's extremely beneficial. And so what I would recommend when you're taking these notes is keep track of triggers of bad behavior in family members, and in yourself if you see them. So this could just be a list somewhere, or it could be, day by day or event by event, this is what triggered it. Situations where you felt betrayed. So you're taking stock of your own emotions and seeing, how did I feel in this situation, what happened, how you behaved in response is very good because you need to take stock of not only what hinders your family members, but you, because that's the one thing that you definitely can control. Times that you attempted a few situations, what they were, and how your family members responded to your attempts. So, lastly, we're going to go over what we've done and just review and say, did this work? Did that work? Is this seem to be going in the right direction? And be on your toes, be creative, and try to get the methods that work. Let them thrive. Do that more. And the ones that don't seem to be working, give it a couple of months and it just hasn't really panned out, or it's even making things worse. Maybe cut those out. Try a different one. All right. So just to end this off, I love this quote by George Bernard Shaw. If you can't get rid of the family skeleton, you may as well make it dance. So you're never going to get a perfect situation. Realistically, family members are going to be perfect, but at least you can have fun when you're dealing with them. And so through all this, take a lighthearted approach. It's fun, it's a game, and if you're having fun with your family, then to me, that is the goal achieved. So I've been Daniel Schwartz with Building Intentional Families and Communities, and when is our next talk?
It's coming up, 10 minutes.
10 minutes, all right.
But I have a question. So,
oh, sorry, questions.
Yeah, questions. I was really excited about you saying get into the person who's betrayed you, getting into their mind, seeing it from their perspective. Can you give us a better example of what that would look like, the process, and what that might look like?
Well, there's a ton of different ways to do it, and the way I like to do it is to actually visualize myself from their eyes, looking through their eyes in that situation, and try to think back as much as I know about their personality, their past. What could they be thinking in this situation? How does what I do or what other people do, how could it appear to them? And a lot of times we don't necessarily know, and this is kind of something that you build up with practice, being able to perceive this, but just take the time to try different possibilities. Did I potentially come across, view how you spoke to them from neutral eyes or from their eyes, and say what their biases, did maybe I feel confrontational to them when I felt like I was being attacked? Or did I feel like, maybe they didn't have any idea what I was saying at all? A lot of times people don't, you say something and you think you got the point across, but the way people took it is just 180, completely the opposite. And so, just take time to entertain. I just take time to entertain all the different possibilities and then try to link up what the different possibilities were with what really happened and go, okay, well this seems to fit the mold. The way that they responded, it didn't quite make sense to me at the time, but if I look at it through the eyes of they were being confronted, maybe that makes sense. So
Great, thank you.
Anything else? Oh, if anybody wants a copy of these slides, just feel free to. I can email it after the event. I know people were taking a lot of notes, and I tend to have very word-filled slides. So if you want me to email it to you, just write your name on the back on the table back there, and I'll email it to you, or write your email.
Great, thank you, Dan.